Yeah, yeah.
So, if you guys do not know us, my name's Chris. This is my wife Ashley. I think we do know most of you though.
Para algunos de los que no me conocen, mi nombre es Chris, esta es mi esposa Ashley. Yo creo que ya conozco casi todos ustedes.
And Pastor Marsh asked if I could start us off this morning with prayer and just introducing and telling you what we got going on.
Esta mañana vamos a comenzar con oración y me voy a presentar un poco acerca de mí y el proyecto que tenemos.
So, as some of you know, and as you're about to find out, we are the newest church planters in the state, and we're planting a church in San Diego.
Como muchos de ustedes ya saben, nosotros somos la nueva pareja que estamos plantando una iglesia aquí en el estado de California, el área de San Diego.
And really, just to preface that, I just wanted you guys to understand, we are thankful to be a part of what you guys are already doing in the state of California.
Y simplemente quiero que ustedes entiendan que nosotros estamos contentos de ser parte de lo que ustedes ya están haciendo aquí en el estado de California.
It's really exciting to be able to come to one of these things and see so many people that want to be built up and to know more and to get inspired to go and do things in their community.
Es muy emocionante estar en una clase de eventos como este, en el cual todos nos animamos los unos a los otros a continuar con las cosas hacia adelante.
So, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for praying for us, for the support you've shown us while we were in the Czech Republic, and now joining you guys here in California.
Muchísimas gracias por todo el apoyo que nos han dado a nosotros, especialmente durante el tiempo que estuvimos en la República Checa, pero ahora aquí en California.
And if I don't know you, or if I haven't got to say hi to you, please come and say hello. We would love to talk with you and share about what God's already doing in San Diego.
Y si no lo conozco a usted, por favor, tome algún tiempo para venir a conocernos, así podemos platicar y podemos compartir con usted lo que estamos haciendo en la área de San Diego.
But let me kick this thing off and let's pray and start this off right.
Comencemos en oración.
Lord God, we love you and we thank you so much for being so good.
Padre Celestial, te agradecemos tanto por ser tan bueno.
We thank you for the opportunity to be able to serve you in various ministries and churches around the state.
Te agradecemos por la oportunidad que nos das de servirte a ti en las iglesias y los diferentes ministerios en el estado.
We pray that you would continue to lead and guide us in the way that we should reach the people in our community.
Padre Celestial, te pedimos por favor que nos ayudes, que nos guíes en la manera en que te podemos servir mejor.
I'm thankful for the people that are here to able to teach and show us new things maybe that we don't know or understand quite yet.
Te agradecemos, Señor, por las personas que están aquí para enseñarnos cosas nuevas que a lo mejor no comprendemos.
And I pray that we would not just forget these things, but we would go home and implement these things in our churches to build a stronger body around us.
Y yo te pido, Padre Celestial, que no se nos olviden estas cosas, sino que se queden con nosotros y las podamos aplicar y implementar en nuestros lugares y nuestras iglesias.
I thank you for every man and woman in this place and their willingness to serve you.
Yo te agradezco, Señor, por cada hombre y por cada mujer que están aquí y por su disposición a servirte.
Lord, place people in our path that we can win to you.
Señor, pon personas en nuestros caminos que podamos ganarte para ti.
And may everything that we do be for your glory, Lord.
Y que todo lo que hagamos sea para tu gloria, Señor.
We love you and we thank you so much for being so good and awesome.
Te amamos, te agradecemos todas las cosas que eres con nosotros, Señor.
Amen.
Amén.
Well, good morning.
Buenos días.
It is great to be back with you again today,
Está muy bien estar con ustedes esta mañana.
and I am excited that Chris and Ashley were able to kick this off this morning.
Yo les agradezco a ustedes el tiempo de estar aquí. Le agradezco al hermano Chris y a su señora que nos ayudó a estar aquí.
It's been a great privilege of North American Ministries to partner with them,
Ha sido un gran privilegio para nosotros el compartir con ellos en esta obra.
and if you don't know Chris and his his wife Ashley,
Si usted no conoce al hermano Chris y a su hija, perdón, a su esposa Ashley,
you do need to get to know them. You will be better people to know them.
haga tiempo para platicar con ellos y conocerlos.
All right, we're going to get this first session kicked off by talking about creating healthy church systems.
Vamos a empezar ahorita con este seminario, pero me parece que tenemos una clase, hermano José Luis.
Everybody,
We have a Spanish class and we have the class for the ladies also.
the ladies are not meeting the first session. No.
No, okay,
But
okay, but we have a Spanish class.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
all right. The left hand knowing what the right hand is not doing, right? Okay, so Spanish speakers are going to go out, so we don't have to translate for this session. I guess that's good. That gives me twice the time. So which I need. So if you did not get your copy, if you're a pastor of the book, they are up here, and I hope you do come and get the book. They've already paid for it, so I appreciate it so much that the mission board had the foresight and the vision to provide the books. And Mark asked me yesterday how long it took me to write the book, and that's kind of a tricky question because really it took me probably about 30 years, but it really is a process that I've been thinking through that long and working on when it comes to just kind of the ideas and stuff that really I was trying to figure out as a pastor. Like, you know, how do we get through these things, and what are some things we need to do differently? And I kind of think in this way. I can take the simplest concept and complicate it. And so I think in kind of complicated terms sometimes. And bless you. And she rivals my sister. I've always said my sister had the loudest sneeze, but that may be a very close second. And so I forgot what I was saying. So I didn't want to go there. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. So anyway, but the actual process of writing the book, because I had a lot of it done as far as kind of things I had taught over the years and different lessons that I kind of put together and the systems that are actually in the book. So the actual putting the book together was about a 6-month process, and then the editing process was actually harder than writing the book. When you go through a publisher that does a lot of editing suggestions and all that, it can be quite interesting, complicated. But I learned a lot through the process, and I'm very thankful to Randall House, or now D6 Family Ministry, for publishing the book. But we're going to go through this information at a 30,000-foot level. I mean, we really can't spend a lot of time in any particular area breaking it down because we just don't have, there's no way in the 30 minutes that we have in this session to really be able to do that. So hopefully you can, spark enough interest that you'll find it in the book. So we start just kind of with the premise that we know that the condition of the church in America is not good. We know that by a lot of studies that we read about and that we see, say that 80 to 90% of churches are in decline. Actually, I think it's probably more towards the 90 and above of churches that are in decline when we really look at church growth and how churches are growing. Because of the churches that are growing, the small 10 to 20%, most of them are growing by transfer growth. And so in other words, the church down the street has a better kids program, or somebody likes their music program, or this church is just kind of the happening thing in the community. So a lot of people just kind of shift over to different churches. And they're really, according to Exponential, only about 4% of churches in America are growing by conversion growth. And it's called Level 5 churches. And so those churches are very, very few. And so we know that there's obviously a problem. If our mission is to go and make disciples, if we're not making disciples, then there's a problem. And I think that a lot of churches are sick and we just don't know it yet. And I tell my story in the book, but back in the year 2000, 24 years ago now, the National Convention was here in California, very near my hometown of Garden Grove in Anaheim. And I was pastoring at the time, and we came to the convention. And on Wednesday night of the convention, we stood up for the invitation, and it was like somebody stabbed me in the gut with a hot knife. I mean, I just had this immense pain. And to make a very long story short, I ended up that night in the emergency room. They ran a few tests and said that they, weren't really conclusive, and I needed to have more tests, and they wanted to admit me in the hospital. And but I said, I was 1,400 miles from home, was living in Oklahoma at the time, and pastoring in southern Oklahoma, and I said, can I get home and go to the doctor there and have these tests run? And they agreed. And so they had got me feeling a lot better, and like any typical man, I was feeling better, so we decided to stay for a few more days, and which was a bad mistake because I was very, very sick again by the time we left. And finally got back to Oklahoma and went immediately to the hospital, and they began running tests, and after surgery and frozen sections and different things, they discovered I had colon cancer. And I tell that story because leading up to that, I was 26, 26 or 27, I don't remember for sure. When this happened, I had 3 young kids at home. I was pastoring a church. It was I wasn't even really, didn't feel that bad until the symptoms got so extreme that it actually, my body started shutting down. But looking back after that, I realized, you know what, for the last several months, I haven't really been feeling good. And when I ate certain foods, my body would react in certain ways, and I'd begun losing weight and just feeling better when I was hungry than I felt when I had food in my stomach. And so I started looking back and thinking, there were a lot of symptoms. I just didn't recognize them as symptoms of a bigger problem. And I think that's where a lot of churches are today. Churches are showing symptoms, but they're ignoring the symptoms. And we'll talk more about this in my next session when I tell my revitalization story. But we kind of lose heart a lot of times in that we know the numbers are declining, and so we stop counting. We know that we're not really baptizing anybody, so we just don't talk about it. We know the finances are struggling, and so we just kind of trim where we can and don't really address the deeper issues. And that's kind of where we are in the churches. And so we have to realize that we have to start addressing the problem today, or the problem is just going to continue to get worse and worse and worse. And so the thing that we have to do, and I am a big believer in that, we have to focus on church health. If our churches are healthy, then it will put us in a place to where our church can grow. It's not a guarantee. It doesn't mean that your church is going to explode. It doesn't mean that you're going to be the next mega church in your community, but it means that you will at least set yourself up so that you can see some growth if your church is healthy. And there's some spiritual elements that I'm going to just basically name, and then we're going to move on. But please don't take my brevity here of a lack of importance. There is nothing more important than the spiritual elements, to be honest. Things like prayer and fasting and understanding that we are in spiritual warfare. And the devil will not let your church go unnoticed if you start making disciples. He is going to attack your church. He is going to do everything that he can to attack your family. It is a very serious thing, but there is this spiritual element that has to be there in order for our churches to be healthy. We talked about prayer a little bit last night and about how that is the foundational part of the structure for everything that we do. But then there's also some mechanical elements, and these are very, very important, and a lot of times we don't think about them in terms of health of our churches, but there are what I call the mechanical elements, and there are things like your legal documents at your church incorporation. I was just teaching this not too long ago at a pastor's boot camp in our office, and one of the pastors said, our church isn't incorporated. And I thought, how in the world can your church not be incorporated? But we find it all the time, and your church may not be incorporated. But if your church is not incorporated, then you can be personally liable if somebody sues your church. And just basic incorporation is a huge step in just protecting you and your leaders when it comes to lawsuits and different things like that. And so a lot of times people just don't know about that. So it's very important to be incorporated, that your church constitution and bylaws are up to date. Most pastors, if they know where their bylaws are, they haven't read them in years. And a lot of times our bylaws are so out of date that we don't live by them anymore because times have changed and the church has moved on from things. But if your church is ever sued, and believe me, we live in a society where churches are being sued every single day, and so it's not unusual for churches being sued nowadays. And a judge is going to look at your constitution and bylaws, and they expect you to live by the rules that you have set up in your bylaws. And so if those rules are outdated, you need to update your constitution and bylaws to make your church be able to be healthy so that you can grow. Again, more in the book about that. I don't have time to really unpack all of that. But your tax-exempt status, a lot of different things. You need to make sure that those legal documents are in place. And then church assessment. We talked about this a little bit last night. But you have to assess your facilities, your leadership, your worship services, your ministries. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But just being really gut-level honest with yourself and realizing that, yes, we've got some things we need to improve on, some areas where we need to do better. And so that starts with assessment. And then also just recognizing and nailing down things like your mission, vision, and values, so that you can say our church is about making disciples, and our church is about having an influence in our community. Our church is about these things as our values. And so then focusing on church health will allow your church to begin to grow naturally. That's what I was talking about just a moment ago. So let me just real quickly talk about systems as we get into this part of it and kind of define what I'm talking about, because we use the word system in a lot of different ways. But for our purpose in talking about healthy systems of a church, systems are individual structural components that work together to create or to form a whole. So in other words, you can think about it like the human body. There's a lot of different systems in the body, right? There's the circulatory system, the skeletal system, all the different systems of the body. And all of those systems need to be, first of all, present, but they also need to be functioning properly in order for our body to be healthy, right? Somebody can look healthy on the outside, so can churches, but if we've got some kind of a breakdown within the body, it's going to eventually show, as I explained earlier about my story. You can also think about it like links of a chain. So if you think about the 8 systems of the church being 8 individual chain links, it's not really a chain until they're linked together, right? But we also know that a chain is only as strong as what? Its weakest link. And so if you have missing or weak systems, it's going to break down the entire structure of your church. So in systems thinking, we talk about the individual structural components, the 8 individual systems that work together to form the whole. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So let's talk quickly about, again, the 30,000-foot flyover view, because I could talk about this stuff for hours. But there's what I've identified as 8 essential systems that I think every church needs to have in order to be healthy. The first one is outreach. Our churches have to be about reaching outside of the walls of our church. When we typically think about outreach, we think about events, but there's a lot of things that need to happen before events are even considered. Things going all the way back to like our marketing, and I know that's kind of a bad word in some circles in the church, but marketing is just simply how your people know and learn about your church. So that includes things like your church logo, your social media strategy, your website, your advertising, before you ever get to events. And a lot of times I talk about this stuff and churches say, well, we don't have a logo. We don't really have a social media strategy. A lot of churches do have websites. I was on one the other day that still had information from 2018 on it. And so a lot of times websites are just something that's out there and we forget about them. But all of those things are so important because now, according to recent studies, like 90% of millennials and Gen Zers, and certainly Alpha Gen as they come up now, they're going to check you out online before they ever set foot in your building. In fact, I was just at a church a few weeks ago in Illinois, one of our mission works there in Champaign, and I met a young man that I had never met before, and I was just talking to him because he was new, and I was talking to him about how he had started coming to the church, and he had told me that he and his girlfriend had moved together to the area. And he said, I grew up in church. He said, I wasn't living right, wasn't living for the Lord. He said, my girlfriend and I were living together. And he said, but I knew I needed to be in church. And he said, so I started watching church services online. And he said, I watched several, I don't remember how many he said, but it was a good number of church services online. And he said, I started watching The Bridge, which is the name of the church in Champaign. And he said, I started watching their services online. And he said, and finally, he said, I knew I had to come to this church. And so he started coming, and then him and his girlfriend eventually got married, and it's just been he's involved in the ministry there at the church. And so it was just a great story about how that online presence led them to come to that church. And so social media, whether you like social media or not, it is a reality of the day, okay? Everybody is on social media. When I say everybody, I know, not literally, but I mean almost everybody is on social media. And so if you are not leveraging the fact that there are so many people on social media, you are missing the greatest outreach opportunity that your church can singly have, which I believe is a social media strategy. And then things, again, like your website advertising. And then we get to events. So when we think about events, there's basically two types of events. There's on-site events that we do at our church, and there's off-site events, so things we do in the community. The purpose of every off-site event is to eventually get people to come to your church, right? To come to your campus or your property. And so when we think about events, there's basically three parts to every event. There's planning, there's the event itself, and then there's follow-up. And a lot of churches break down when it comes to the follow-up. We understand the planning. You got to plan for an event, and then you have the event. But if you are not following up on the contacts that you make during an event, you're missing out the greatest single opportunity that you have when it comes to holding the event in the first place. And so even if it's an Easter egg hunt or a fall festival or whatever it is that you do at your church, you need to have some way to register people so that you can follow up. I was at a church not a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and they had a huge outreach event, and they had hundreds, literally hundreds of people come to their outreach event. And my wife and I were there, and I saw nothing going on as far as registering. And I talked to the pastor, and I said, did you register people for this event? He said, no. He said, we didn't really do that. And I said, man, you guys spent a lot of money, invested a lot of hours, had a lot of volunteers, and yes, they touched the community, but they had no way to follow up. And so the next year, they did that event, and they had a process where you had to come and fill out a little form to get a ticket to participate in the event. That's gold right there. Just gives people a way that you can follow up. And even if you can get a person's name, cell phone number, and email address, you can follow up with them many ways just with that right there. And so follow-up is such a key, important part of outreach. But we've got to focus on outside the walls, and that's what I'm going to talk about in my next session that I'll have with you later today in my revitalization story. The second system is connections. So how do we take people that are not connected to our church, and how do we get them connected to our church? And really it starts way before they ever come to your church. Again, it starts even in the outreach phase. And a lot of these systems, like a chain overlaps, the links overlap, these systems will overlap as well. And so connections begins really at first impressions. What do people think of your church when they drive by? Do they think, oh, that church is abandoned? I heard the story told just recently. I don't even know if Dr. Moody may have told this story. I don't remember who told the story, but somebody I heard recently said that there was a church in a community, and it looked abandoned because there was never any cars there. The grass was grown up, and somebody called the church number and said, we're interested in buying this property if this is an abandoned building. And they said, well, what do you mean an abandoned building? We have church every week. And but it didn't look like it, and they literally, the community thought the building was abandoned. And so, you know, what does the community think of your church when they drive by? And then what is your church known for in the community, if it's known at all? Is it known for something? And so it starts way before the first visit. And then how do we follow up with guests? I think it is a very important process to think about. Most churches do follow up, or at least have some kind of follow-up with a first-time guest. We ask them sometimes to fill out a connection card or a visitor's card or whatever. And let me just say 2 or 3 things real quick about that. First of all, personally, I don't like the word visitor. A visitor is somebody that shows up at my house unannounced and knock on my door and makes my dog bark and makes me get out of my chair and go, answer the door. And I don't really want them there. But a guest is somebody that I have invited, and I prepare for them, and I want them to be there. And so I think that if we kind of fade out the word visitor and use the word guest, it just gives a lot warmer feeling. When a guest comes to my house, I offer them something to eat and to drink, and I offer them to sit in my chair, and they're welcome to look around my house, and a visitor certainly is not allowed to do those things. And so I think there is kind of a difference when we think about a visitor and a guest. And the other thing is your connection card or your visitor's card, guest card. If it looks like a credit card application, nobody's going to fill it out. And a lot of times they are, right? They're 2-sided cards. They ask all these different questions that you're never going to use. And so my advice is don't ask for any more information than you absolutely need at the beginning to follow up with them. You can get their kids' names and ages and all that stuff later. If you can get, again, their name, their phone number, their email address, and maybe how they heard about your church, that's all you need on a guest registration card. And then you can get more information from them later. So that's a first-time guest, but how do we get a first-time guest to become a second-time guest? And how do we get a second-time guest to become a third-time guest? And then a regular attender, fourth time, fifth time, until they're finally, beginning to get incorporated in the life of our church. There needs to be some kind of a process to do that. But the truth is most churches don't track anything other than first-time guests. And I know that that's a little complicated, and you've got to figure out what will work in your church. The way we did it when I was pastoring was we had an auditorium that had a balcony, and we had a lady that grew up in our church. She had been there her whole life, and she knew everybody in our church. And so we actually printed a roll sheet every Sunday, and she would stand up in the balcony as church was getting started, and she would basically check off who was there. And if she didn't recognize somebody, she would write down guest in blue shirt, whatever, and would tell what section they were in, because we had 3 seating sections like this. And we had what we called section greeters in our church, where most people sit in the same area every Sunday, right? And so if there was somebody new in their section, their job was to go and meet that person. And then we would try to put names with those people, and we would, even if they didn't fill out a card, we would try to find out who knew them, how could we follow up with them. We were very intentional. We worked very hard about trying to connect people back to our church. And so you've got to have some kind of a process that works for your church so that you can make first-time guests, second-time guests, third-time guests, because every time they come back, your chances of getting them to stay at your church exponentially goes up, right? So every time they come, they're showing more and more interest. So what is the process that in your church to move people from a first-time guest to a fully developed disciple or somebody that is a regular attender or member of your church? There's another thing that I don't have time to even really scratch the surface on this, but it is in the book. But there are certain steps, and we'll actually cover these again later when we talk about another system. But there's things like LifeTrack or a new members class, kind of introductory class. That's how you can move people into it, by inviting people to come to LifeTrack and then getting them involved in a Sunday school class or a small group, and then D groups, ministry training, getting them involved in being on a serve team, sending them out on mission in your church. And so then a part of that is, how are people in your church going to know the process? You have to talk about it. You have to say, if you're not involved in a LifeTrack, LifeTrack is starting up this Sunday. We want to invite you to come to LifeTrack. Hey, have you been through LifeTrack one-on-one? You're inviting people. You're making sure people know the process, and then you develop a pathway. And I'll show some more of that a little bit later on. The third system is discipleship. So this is a huge one, and again, I don't have time to even scratch the surface here. Hopefully I'm just whetting your appetite a little bit, so you'll read it in the book. But how does your church make disciples? What is the process that your church has to move people from point A to point B? What are the specific steps involved in making disciples? The truth is, if churches were honest, they would have to say, we don't really have a process. We just hope people will come to Sunday school and get involved in Sunday school. Well, if all you have to make disciples is your preaching and a 30-minute lesson or so in Sunday school, is that really enough to make a disciple? I just want you to think about that, because I don't think it is. I don't think 1 or 2 hours a week is enough to really make disciples. And so it has to be a lot more specific and a lot more steps involved than just that. So you have classes, and I mentioned like LifeTrack, small group, discipleship groups, all those types of things. But it also includes the pulpit teaching. So pastors, a very specific question to you, but do you think about discipleship when you're preaching your sermons? A lot of times we just preach whatever we want to preach on. We don't really think much about, are we really discipling people through our messages? I'm just being honest. I didn't think much about that when I was pastoring and preaching every week. I just, we either preached through a book, or I, would preach topical sermons or a series or whatever it might be. But to say that I actually thought about my preaching being a part of discipleship, it didn't happen for many years for me. And it was something I had to think through on, how is my pulpit pulpit teaching a part of making disciples. And then your children's ministry, your youth ministry. And let me just put in a plug. I don't work for Randall House or D6 Family Ministry, but I love the D6 concept and the D6 program, to where everybody in the family is in the same text and the same themes, so that when you do go home, and that's what D6 is all about, right? When your kids wake up, when you're putting them to bed, when you're going through life, you're doing everything with them, you can talk about these things because you're all dealing with the same types of things. And so I love the D6 model, and I strongly encourage you, if you're not familiar with it or you don't use D6, I think it's a brilliant concept, and I think something that really does help make disciples. And so I would encourage you to look at it. But then even our special events, the things that we do at our church, do we just do events for the sake of doing events, or are our events really targeted at making disciples? And so if we think about, and you'll hear me say it, you've already heard me say it 1,000 times, but I'll say it 1,000 times more, it's everything should be about making disciples, making disciples, making disciples in everything that we do. System 4 is worship planning. Worship planning is one that probably most churches have in place at some level, but there's a lot more to it than I think we often think about. I grew up in church. I've mentioned already I'm from Southern California, and even when I was a teenager, I was musically inclined, and I was a music student, and I sang, and so I was the song leader at our church when I was like 14, 15 years old, and my duties as the song leader was getting to church early enough to dog-ear 3 or 4 hymn pages, and we always sang one hymn, verses 1, 2, and 4. I don't know why, it's just what we did. We didn't tell anybody that, and nobody really knew why we only sang 1, 2, and 4, but that's just what we always did. And so we sang the one opening hymn, the call to worship, and then the pastor would come and tell a joke or make announcements or whatever pastors do in that first time. And then we'd sing 2 more hymns, and then we'd have the offering, and then we'd sing another hymn, and then someone would get up and sing a special that a lot of times wasn't very special. Pastor would, did I say that out loud? Man. And this is on Facebook too. I'm going to be in trouble. So then we have the invitation. I mean, just every Sunday, same thing, right? You all know what I'm talking about because we've all been there and we do that. And really, very little thought I think goes into a church service on Sunday mornings. But that 1 hour that we have on Sunday morning, a lot of times is the only time that we really have to connect with people that do come to our church or watch us online. I thought this was an interesting study that I read not long ago that was talking about why reasons people don't attend church. And we think there's a lot of reasons, but according to this statistic from Reach Right, and Dr. Moody has some statistics on the great de-churching and things that are a little bit different than this, but still the point is that almost a quarter of people move and just couldn't find a church. And so it's not that they're mad at the church, it's not that they're disgruntled, it's not that they're atheists, it's just that they haven't found a church that's right for them. And so that just is a free gift to us as churches, that a fourth of the people that are moving into our areas aren't mad at church. Nobody's really taken time to invite them or try to get them to come to our church. So that's just a little important thing about why people don't go to church. And so our worship planning should be important because and I hate like anything to use this word, but there's no other word to use, but we're competing with every other church in our community, right? And we're not competing in the sense like, I know that, but I mean, they have a lot of choices. If somebody's going to attend church, they have a lot of places that they can go. And I can promise you, your church is not going to be the biggest, it's not going to be the richest, it's not going to have the best kids program, it's not going to have the best music program. But if we can do the very best with whatever it is that we have and really love people and help people feel that love, then that is a huge win, and people are looking for that and they want that, and those will be the type of people that we can get. But my experience in the last 17 years, I've been in denominational leadership either on the national or the state level, and I have visited over 300 Free Will Baptist churches in the last 17 years, and just my opinion, but very little thought and preparation goes into a Sunday morning service. It really does. It's just everybody just kind of shows up and they do their thing. A lot of times teachers aren't really very prepared for their classes. They've been busy and they don't put much thought or preparation into the Sunday school class. Things don't start on time. There's a lot of wasted time. And man, if we're really talking about discipleship, we need to leverage every single minute we have. And that only comes through really good planning. And so we've got to put a lot of planning into our worship service. But also our setup, decor. Does your church look the same as it's always looked? Is there anything new or interesting? I encourage people to just think about things like if you're preaching a series on the family or whatever, set up a little living room with a couple of chairs or something on your stage and invite a family or a couple that's been married for a long time that has a successful marriage. Invite them up and do an interview with them, ask them some questions. Just do something a little bit different that's going to create some interest and help people to realize, hey man, something new is going on here. This is interesting. This is different. So instead of just doing the same thing, first, second, and fourth verse, we don't know why, but it's just what we do, kind of break that up. And I'm not saying go home and like turn everything upside down because you'll probably get fired if you do that. But I mean, just introduce slow changes and just do something different in your order of service, sermon topics, whatever. Just creating connections with people. If you fail to connect with people, then you will fail to connect them to the church. It's all about the relationships. It's all about that personal touch. System 5 is financial. This is another huge one. There's so many things to talk about, but things like church budgets. There's a lot of churches that don't even have a budget, and your church needs to have a budget. You need to know where you were last year, where you're trying to get to this year or next year, and you can do that better through a budget. But reporting, how does your church report to the congregation? Most churches give a year-end statement that tells how much that family is, how much that family is given to your church that year. But I think it's important to honor people for their faithfulness and for their giving. And so every quarter or every 6 months at the least, I think we should be sending thank you letters that just say thank you so much for your faithful support of our church. Because of your generosity, we've been able to help start churches in North America through North American Ministries. We've partnered with these IM missionaries that have been doing these things across the globe. We've given to Welch College or CCC or whatever it is that you're, well, not CCC now, I guess, but Randall or whatever it is, something, just a local crisis pregnancy center or to some local ministry, whatever it could be, and just say because of your faithfulness, that God has allowed us to be able to do these things. And so it helps people realize that their offering is more than just paying for the light bill and paying your salary as a pastor, but that you really are making a difference in the world. And then simple things like who has the authority to spend money. A lot of times, a Sunday school teacher, can they redecorate their class? Can they spend money? Can they buy supplies? What are the rules about that? Having some type of an annual internal audit to protect your treasurer and your finance team and that sort of thing. And then also doing some kind of an annual stewardship emphasis. There's just all kinds of things about that. But then creating multiple ways to give. COVID kind of forced us to do this. Before COVID, a lot of churches were just passing the plate. But during COVID, we realized that, hey, you know what? We're missing out on a lot of ways. And now most churches get more money in on other days of the week than they do on Sundays. They get it through their websites or apps or whatever. And so if the first falls on a certain day of the week, it automatically comes out and goes to your church. That's a huge win for churches, for consistency and planning and budgeting and all that. But we've got to create multiple ways for people to give because most people don't carry cash. They don't have checks. And so we've got to create multiple ways for people to give. And they're doing some kind of what we call a tithe talk or a generous living moment, again, where when our ushers come up to take up the offering or we talk about giving online or whatever, we can just take a moment and just say, hey, we just wanted you to know that because of your faithful support and your giving, we're able to do these things in our community. So again, just letting people know that it's bigger than just the four walls of your church. And then what I say, just being a generous church, we want people in our church to be generous to our church, right? We want our people to give. Shouldn't our church also be generous outside of our church? But the truth is a lot of churches are kind of like the Dead Sea. They want inlets coming into it, but then they just want to keep it all. And I don't think that's a very healthy place to be. And so a church ought to be a generous church. They ought to support things in their community, whether it's a crisis pregnancy center or a soup kitchen or whatever it might be in a local, but then also not just Jerusalem, but Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. System 6 is member care. Again, there's a lot of pieces of this. Real quick, it's basically how do we care for people in our church and our community. So what's the system or what's the process that our church has for caring for our flock in general? If there's a need, if there's a death in a family, how do we reach out to that family? What do we provide for them? What do we do? How do we care for the sick, the shut-ins, the orphans, the widows, the needy, the hurting? What is our church's policy for people that just drop in that need help with their rent or their electric bill or whatever? We need to have some kind of a policy that helps not only take care of our church, but also our community. And each one of these things we could talk much about, and I don't have time, but just need to have some kind of a system so that your church knows how they're cared for. And then system 7 is leadership. I've said this, I think, with every one of them, but this is another huge one that has a lot of different pieces to it. But there's paid staff and volunteer staff. Because the truth of the matter is most of our churches are one-staff churches, right? It's the pastor. And a lot of times he's bivocational. And so you say, well, we don't really have staff. Well, I say even your upper-level volunteers, people that are in leadership, we can consider those people our leadership team or our staff. And I think that every person in our church needs to have some kind of expectations, and that comes through a job or a ministry description with some kind of policy and procedures manual. So in other words, if you have Sunday school teachers that you expect to be in their class 15 minutes before class time starts, or they have to be there 30 minutes before class starts, or you want to do a team huddle with all of your people before church or whatever, that needs to be spelled out so that people know what they can expect. It's hard to hold people accountable for things if they didn't even know they were supposed to do that. But if we have very clear expectations up front, then we can hold people accountable, even volunteers. And I believe that we would be a lot more successful in keeping volunteers and recruiting new volunteers if we were more specific up front with what we expected out of our volunteers and all of our ministry leadership people and all of that sort of thing. So, and also, again, I mentioned recruiting volunteers, but how do we recruit volunteers? Most of the time we do it from the pulpit, and we do it out of crisis, right? We get up and we say things like, man, we have got to have more volunteers to work in our nursery. Ladies, if you're not volunteering to work in our nursery, we really need you in the nursery. We don't have enough volunteers. Well, I'm a first-time guest that just dropped my baby off in the nursery, sitting there hearing that. What do you think I'm going to think? Right? I'm probably going to go get my kid and go home. Like, I'm not going to, that's pretty serious. And so instead of recruiting volunteers, well, let me say one more thing about that before I move on, that a lot of times when we recruit volunteers like that, we recruit people out of guilt. We recruit them out of obligation, right? They're like, oh, well, I guess no one else will volunteer, so I don't really want to work with, I don't like babies, but I guess I'll work in the nursery. Do we really want people in our nursery that don't like kids? Do we really want people teaching our 4th, 5th, and 6th grade boys that don't like 4th, 5th, and 6th grade boys? I mean, I know that that's a kind of a catch-all situation because that's they're tough jobs sometimes, but God is equipping and calling people to do things if we'll recruit them in the right way. And if we'll observe, first of all, and we'll see somebody that just looks like they have a great rapport with young kids or whatever, go to them personally and say, hey, man, I've just noticed that kids really seem to like you. And I see kids coming up and hugging your leg and giving you high fives, and you're handing out candy or whatever. And would you be interested in praying about doing this? And to get very specific, what you're asking them to do, what are the expectations? We can train you. We can help you learn how to use the curriculum. If we would recruit more specifically, I think we'd have a lot more success in getting the volunteers that we need. And then system 8, is evaluation. I originally did not have system 8 in, and I'm a weird. We were talking about this earlier. I'm kind of have some OCD, weird, strange things about me, and I like the number 7, so I like everything to be 7s. But But I thought, you know, there needs to be something else in this. And even though I wanted 7 systems, I have 8, because evaluation is a system that I think many churches are missing. And I learned this as a pastor in that we don't really have a way to evaluate things in our church. If we ever say, hey, this isn't working or whatever, it's like, what do you mean that's not working? That's what we've always done that, or we love that, or so-and-so's in charge of that, and they've always done that, or whatever. But we need to have a way to evaluate everything that we do in our church. And if we're honest enough to say, hey, something's not working, then we need to be able to figure out a way to change it, right? And we can't do that if we don't evaluate. So we need to have a process for change. And one of the things that we can do is have regular staff meetings. And again, you say, well, I'm the only staff. Well, I'm talking about with your upper level volunteers, even if it's once a month, provide pizza after church one Sunday or whatever, and have a staff meeting where you can say, hey, how's it going in the kids department? How's it going with the youth? How's it going with women or men or whatever ministries that you might have? Because the truth is as leaders, as pastors, I spend all my time on stage in the auditorium or the sanctuary. I don't know what's going on in the nursery. I don't know what's going on in the kids' classes. And unless somebody is telling me, hey, we've got a problem here, or we need to address this situation, then as the pastor, there's things I'll never know. And so we've got to have a way for people to feel comfortable sharing their struggles, sharing input on, hey, we've got a problem here. We need to figure out a way that we can, change course or whatever. So we need to have that input for evaluation. And then we need to use certain tools. There's all kinds of online tools and programs and apps. I'm not a tech guy. I'm old. I'm not a digital native, but I've learned to use some things, and I've heard about some things. A lot of our church planters use some really great resources. I mentioned a few in the book. I don't have time to go over those now, but there's a lot of things that can help you in your church and help you set up good systems for tracking guests, for following up with guests, for discipleship, a lot of things. And so make sure that you do read and that you listen to podcasts, you talk to other people. If you have a need, there is a solution out there. I guarantee you. There is a solution out there if you'll look for it. And so look for those different online programs and apps. And then what a lot of people call scoreboards, or just things we count. There are certain things we need to keep track of. We need to count. We need to know what our attendance is. We need to know how many we're baptizing. We need to know a lot of different things. But a lot of times churches, especially when they're in decline or whatever, we forget, or we forget about things. We don't want to count things because the numbers are not very encouraging. But if we don't realize that we're down 12 people this year from where we were last year, and we're down 22 people from where we were 2 years ago, that's a problem. We see this downward trajectory, and so we have to keep score so that we know where we are. If we've only baptized one person in the last 3 years, we know we need to be doing more in the areas of discipleship and trying to get more new converts and all that, so scoreboards. And then understanding vicious cycles. I talk about this in the book and use some examples. But basically, it's like, a lot of churches are stuck in the mud, and when we just keep pushing on the gas, all we're doing is spinning the tires, and we're not making any traction, we're not getting anywhere, right? That's the definition of insanity, according to Einstein, doing the same thing over and over and over again, hoping for different results. You're not going to get any different results from what you're getting right now by doing the same things you're doing today. And so if you want different results, we have to do something different. And so we have to understand these vicious cycles and how to break vicious cycles. If your car is stuck in the mud, you've got to get something and jam it under that tire to get some traction, or you got to throw some rocks under it. You've got to do something, right, to create traction so that you can get the momentum going. And that comes through strategic planning. Again, I don't have time to break down strategic planning. There's a lot to that. But it's basically planning. It's just saying, okay, we got to figure out how we're going to get from point A to point B. All right? I'm over time. I don't think I took a breath the whole time I've been talking. And your ears have definitely not stopped buzzing because I have just vomited information. I apologize for moving so quickly. But anyway, we don't really have time for question and answers. We're already over time. But I'm here all day. So if you have a question, please feel free to let me know, and I will be happy to answer any questions We are going to take a real quick break. According to the schedule, you have 2.5 minutes. So take a real quick break. The ladies will have a breakout. Sister Ruth McDonald will be talking to the ladies, and Dr. Moody will be here in the next session talking about the tools that you need for church revitalization.